Grace's Letter to Lincoln, Chapter 6. Before school, Grace took 3 pennies from her pocketbook. She hurried to the post office. "I'd like a 3-penny stamp," Grace asked Mr. Mann, the postmaster. She handed him the letter. "Mr. Abraham Lincoln," he read out loud. "Please, Mr. Mann, don't tell Papa I wrote Mr. Lincoln. It's a secret." "Must be pretty important," Mr. Mann said. "I'll keep your secret, Grace. I'm a Lincoln man myself." "Thank you, Mr. Mann. I'll be back for Mr. Lincoln's answer." Grace kept her secret. She did not tell anyone about her letter. Each day after school, she ran to the post office. On Wednesday, no letter. On Thursday, no letter. On Friday, no letter. "I wonder why he hasn't written me," Grace said to Mr. Mann. "Grace, Mr. Lincoln has to meet many people to discuss what he will do if he is elected president. He might not have time to write you." "Mr. Lincoln is a gentleman," Grace asserted. "He will write me." That night, Grace practiced Old Dan Tucker on her piano. She sang as she played. "Dan wore his shirt tails outside his coat, buttoned his breeches up around his throat. His nose stuck out, his eyes sunk in, and his beard grew out all over his chin." So Papa joined in. "Get out the way for Old Dan Tucker. He's too late to get his supper. Supper's over and breakfast's cooking. Old Dan Tucker just standing there looking." Grace laughed as she closed the keyboard cover. That night, Grace wondered if Mr. Lincoln would ever write her back. She fell asleep humming Old Dan Tucker. On Monday, Grace raced from school to the post office. A few fat, wet snowflakes drifted down and melted in her hair. Mr. Mann frowned and shook his head. Grace sighed and turned away. "Oh, wait," Mr. Mann said. "There is a letter here addressed private for a Miss Grace Bedell." He held out the letter. A smile blossomed on Grace's face. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Mann, thank you," Grace said. Outside, Grace took a deep breath. She read the address over and over. "Miss Grace Bedell, Westfield, New York, private." A snowflake landed on the envelope. Grace blew it off. Her hand shook as she carefully opened the envelope. A gust of wind rustled the letter. A few more flakes fell, splotching the paper like big freckles. Gripping the letter, Grace read it over and over all the way home. She dashed up the front steps and burst into the house. Mama, Helen, and Alice were in the parlor. "Whenever will you learn to act like a lady?" Alice said. Grace ignored her. "It came! It came!" she shouted. "What came?" Helen asked. "My letter from Mr. Lincoln." "What letter from Mr. Lincoln?" Mama asked. The words flooded out of Grace. "Mr. Lincoln looked so plain that I thought he needed whiskers. I wrote him asking him to grow whiskers. He wrote back, 'Here's the letter.'" Grace was breathless. "Read it," Alice said, a hint of admiration in her voice. Grace took 3 deep breaths and then read her letter. "Private. Springfield, Illinois, October 19th, 1860. Miss Grace Bedell. My dear little miss, your very agreeable letter of the 15th is received. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughters. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age. They, with their mother, constitute my whole family. As to the whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affection if I were to begin it now? Your very sincere well-wisher, A. Lincoln." "Why, Grace, that is wonderful," Alice said. "And to think you had the gumption to write him." "How did you know where to send it?" Helen asked. Grace replied, "I read in the newspaper that Mr. Lincoln lives in Springfield, Illinois." Mama, Helen, and Alice laughed together. "How did you address your letter?" Helen asked. "To the Honorable Abraham Lincoln." "Well, I guess you received the letter all right. The postmaster at Springfield would be in no doubt for whom the letter was intended," said Helen. Grace passed the letter around so they could all read it again. "I do think Mr. Lincoln would look quite handsome with whiskers," Helen remarked. "If I could, I would certainly vote for him, whiskers or not," Mama said, "but it seems as if he will not be growing a beard." "Maybe he will change his mind," Grace said hopefully. Alice held on to the letter. "I don't understand this part," she said. "As to the whiskers, having not worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affection if I were to begin now? Why would he write affection?" "Let me look," Helen said. Alice handed her the letter. "I think he meant to say affectation instead of affection," Helen said. "What does affectation mean?" Grace asked. "It means putting on airs," Alice explained, "like a peacock spreading its tail." "Showing off?" Grace suggested. "Yes," Mama said, "showing off." "He wouldn't be showing off," Grace said. "He would just look more handsome." "His rivals might say he was trying to impress people with his looks just to get elected," Alice continued, "putting on hairs." She snorted at her own joke. That is silly, Helen responded, but I think he would look better. I can't wait until Papa comes home, Grace said. When Papa came home, Grace wiped her hands on her apron and ran to greet him. She threw her arms around him. Papa peeled Grace off. You're like the cat who swallowed the canary, he said. What have you been up to this time? Grace got her letter and without a word handed it to Papa. He read the address. He twisted his mustache. It's not from Grandmama. This is not her handwriting. Must be from a beau. Don't be silly, Papa. I don't have a beau, but it is from a man. I hope he is a gentleman. May I read it? Yes, Papa. Hurry. Teasing her, he slowly withdrew the letter from the envelope. He made exaggerated movements as he dramatically unfolded the paper. As he read the letter, Papa's eyes grew wider and wider. The smile on his face expanded until he chuckled. You wrote old Abe and asked him to grow a beard? Grace nodded her head. And he wrote you back? Grace nodded again. Wherever did you get the idea for him to grow whiskers? From the poster you brought me. Papa shook his head. Grace, 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 he said. Let's go look at this poster. I need to see what old Abe would look like with whiskers. That night, Grace read her letter again and again. When Mama came to tuck her in, Grace was asleep with the letter still in her hands. Mama gently took the letter and placed it beside Grace's poster. Mama stroked Grace's hair. Whatever will you do next? She whispered. The next day, Grace was the center of attention. First the Plums stopped by, then the Brooks, then the Washingtons. A steady stream of visitors came all afternoon. With the election only 2 weeks away, everyone was eager to hold the letter and hear Grace's story. The 2 weeks passed quickly. There were more parades. One evening, the Wide Awakes would march. Another evening would find the Douglas supporters in the streets. There were not enough Bella Breckinridge men in Westmount to mount a parade. As the election neared, the excitement grew. One thing, however, worried Grace. Yes, she wanted Abe Lincoln to win, but she worried about South Carolina's threat to leave the United States if Mr. Lincoln won. At supper one evening, she asked Papa, will South Carolina really leave the United States if Mr. Lincoln is elected? They threatened to, Papa answered, but they have been threatening that since before you were born. Can a state just leave the United States? Helen asked. Stephen answered, the slaveholding states are tired of the northern states bothering them about slavery. If the North will not leave the South alone, the South believes they can form their own country. But won't that mean war? Alice asked. Only if the government takes up arms against any state that secedes, Papa explained. What does secede mean? Grace asked. That means to leave the United States, Papa answered. I hope that Mr. Lincoln does not let them secede when he is president, Grace said. It will mean war, Stephen added. Let us pray that people have more sense than that, Mama said. That night, Grace read Frederick another fable. Her usual enthusiasm for the stories wasn't in her voice. She truly wanted Mr. Lincoln to win, but she also did not want a war. Why couldn't the adults just agree that slavery was bad, that the slaves should be set free to live on their own? Then there would be no war between the states. Before she turned down her lamp, Grace read the letter from Lincoln and gazed at his picture one more time. She felt sure old Abe would win tomorrow.